So this is Tom Cross. I'm the Director of Security Research here at Landcope, and I'm going to talk a little bit about NetFlow and how NetFlow can be applied to the unique information security challenges that financial services institutions face. So perhaps many of you noticed the cover of Bloomberg Business Week, the NASDAQ hack story. So this story is interesting because I don't want to sort of provide you with all the information. You should definitely go read the article. But it starts out with the NSA identifying that a computer on NASDAQ's network was communicating with a command and control location in Russia that they associated with state-sponsored computer intrusions. And so they go to try to investigate the incident, and they discover that they have a lot of trouble figuring out what was going on inside of NASDAQ's network. And initially they think that this might be like some sort of national security threat, and eventually they determine that the attack might have had another motivation. And I definitely recommend reading the article. But for us, I think what was most relevant is the challenge that they had investigating the incident within NASDAQ's environment and the way that affected their ability to make a strong determination about the reason or the motive behind the attack. So there's this quote in the story, which is just priceless from our perspective. And if someone breaks into your house, try to figure out where they went and what they took is pretty difficult because unlike a bank, you don't have cameras in your house. You don't have motion sensors. In terms of cybersecurity, most companies are more like a house than a bank. So, I think the question worth asking for those on the call who represent banks is your bank secured like a bank or like a house? And I think that if you ask your information security team, maybe they would say it was secured like a castle. That metaphor is also apt, but probably also a problem. The castles are really the way that we've been building computer networks for many years. We have very strong perimeter defenses. We're doing a lot of monitoring of our perimeter. We're looking for what we call north-south traffic between our network and the internet, but we're not paying enough attention to the east-west traffic, the stuff that's going on inside of our network. And as a consequence, when we're dealing with these sophisticated targeted attacks, such as the potentially state-sponsored incident that Bloomberg discussed at NASDAQ, those guys have the capability to get past our perimeter. They're operating with vulnerability information that we don't have. They know how to evade commercial security tools, and so they're getting inside of our environment. And the challenge becomes identifying that they're there once they're inside, and being able to understand, what it is that they're attempting to accomplish. So, if you want to run your network more like a bank, you need to have some recording going on of what activities are taking place within that network that provide you with a forensic audit trail that you can investigate in the event that the NSA calls you and tells you that your network has been communicating with some sort of command and control point associated with foreign state-sponsored attacker. And so that starts this thought process of what audit trail sources do exist out there that you should be collecting. And I think that there are three main audit trail sources that people are looking at in order to solve that problem. One of them is syslog. Logs are very valuable, very important, and most organizations are collecting logs and storing them in a SIM. The real question is from what systems are you collecting logs? The second one is NetFlow, which is really what I'm here to focus on, and the third is full packet capture. A lot of people are doing that these days. And basically, the reason I want to discuss this is to help you understand the role that NetFlow plays vis-a-vis these other two audit trail sources. All three of them have a unique piece of the pie that they can see, that other components can't see. So in the case of syslog gives you information from inside of a system. You can't get that from NetFlow. You can't get that from full packet capture. So that's invaluable. But syslog also presents certain challenges. It's difficult to ensure that all of the systems on your network that are supposed to be reporting syslog to you are in fact doing so, because each individual system has to be configured to send you syslog. And so if you have a complicated network, it's changing over time, the fact is that you end up with systems that aren't reporting to you, and so you have blind spots. Secondly, the first thing that an attacker does when they get control of a computer system is, it's typically referred to as rootkitting the box. They do things to hide themselves from syslog so that they aren't visible to syslog monitoring anymore. It's pretty much standard operating procedure for anyone that breaks into a computer. So the reality is that syslog's great up until the point where the computer got compromised, and at that point, you can't trust the logs coming off of it anymore. So we really need to know what happened after computers are compromised, and if we're going to understand that, we need to look to other data sources. Full packet capture is a tremendous resource if you have it, because obviously it gives you a complete recording of every single thing that happened on the network. The problem with full packet capture is that it's incredibly expensive to collect full packet capture across your entire network all the time. And so, and furthermore, if you're going to do it, you have to use probes to do it. And so typically you're only doing it at particular locations. It's difficult to do it absolutely pervasively everywhere in the environment. And so you end up, only with maybe a few days, maybe a week, packet capture, and you're usually doing it at the choke point, again, at the perimeter between your network and the internet, and not really getting a lot of visibility of what's going on inside. So where does NetFlow fit into this picture? NetFlow provides you with an audit trail of the transactions that are occurring on your network. NetFlow provides you with, it doesn't provide you with the content, it's just metadata. It's the source and destination addresses, it's the source and destination ports, it's the amount of bytes being transferred for every network transaction that's occurring in your environment. So NetFlow has a couple of advantages over packet capture and one big disadvantage. So the disadvantage is that you can't see the content. It doesn't record content. But in some respects, that's an advantage because NetFlow it can be stored more efficiently. You could store months or years of NetFlow for the same amount of disk investment that you could store a couple days of full packet capture. So it's really convenient and inexpensive to store. Furthermore, NetFlow is something that actually your routers and switches, your network equipment already is capable of producing. Generally speaking, any piece of network equipment out there has the ability to produce NetFlow, and you can just turn it on. So you don't have to deploy probes in order to collect NetFlow. You can collect NetFlow right from the routers and switches in your environment, and that means that you can get pervasive visibility into all layers of the network. So typically, if you look at this network map, if you were deploying packet capture, you'd probably do it right there where the firewall is, so that you see, the stuff coming from your network to the internet and the traffic coming off the VPN, the DMZ. That's going to be the most typical place that you would deploy that. You're not going to see. So if one of these computers back at the back here gets infected with malware, and then that malware infection, that attacker is pivoting to the other systems back here in the back, you're not going to see that lateral activity by looking from the firewall. But with NetFlow, you can start collecting telemetry from each one of those access switches as well as that core or distribution switch. And you can get all of that east-west internal visibility as well as the north-south visibility. And so that gives you a more complete picture of everything that happened on the network. And although you can't see the content, often a lot of this communication is encrypted anyway. And so, really getting the metadata is often, as valuable or more valuable than getting the content. So let me just provide a few basics about NetFlow. NetFlow, so I explained that NetFlow is something that routers and switches and firewalls typically are capable of producing. They're called exporters. Any network device that you have is probably capable of becoming a NetFlow exporter. And what you do is you configure those devices to send their NetFlow to a destination IP address, which is the collector. And so all those devices then start producing these records, which are sent in EDT packets over the network to the NetFlow collector every time a network transaction occurs. It's really easy to configure one of your routers or switches to become a NetFlow exporter. So this set of slides, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it just shows you it's just a few lines of configuration in a Cisco router or switch, for example, to make it a NetFlow exporter. You just configure the IP address of the collector and you tell it to start going. And so now you can see what's going on at all levels within your network. And so that provides you with an audit trail that you can investigate in the event that attack activity was happening back inside your network and you need to piece it back together again. And fortunately, it's an audit trail that's coming from your routers and switches. It's not coming from your endpoints. And so, once attackers compromise an input, they can manipulate syslog reporting, but they can't prevent the switch from continuing to report the network transactions that are coming off of it without a more in-depth sort of process. So, what are the key advantages of NetFlow versus some of these other technologies? The first is that it's really easy to configure. Your network already speaks it. It's standardized. And it doesn't have to be configured at every endpoint. You only need to configure it at the switches and routers that you want to see. And typically, you have tighter control over the configuration of your network devices than you do over the configuration of your endpoints. In addition, as I mentioned, the records are compact, they're inexpensive to store, and it's easy to get visibility down to the access layer. I think what's really important here is that our customers tell us that they have better visibility into what's happening on their network with NetFlow than they do with any of their other technologies. And I think the standardization and the ease of configuration are key reasons why that's the case. Typically what people are trying to do is like put all their firewall logs on their SIM, but chances are they got a bunch of different firewalls. Those firewalls all log in different formats. They may be configured differently with respect to what they log, and the bottom line is that they don't end up seeing everything. A large financial institution is probably doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and so you keep on bringing in these new networks that become part of the mothership, but they were built on a completely different security and networking philosophy. They probably have different vendors' equipment in there, and it could take a long time to get that network operating on the same sort of standards and same technologies that you're using throughout the rest of the business. It's very easy to go to the routers and switches in that environment and turn NetFlow on because they all speak it. It's standardized, it instantly gives you visibility into that environment. It's much easier to obtain than, say, shipping a device to them for them to deploy on their network. And so, organizations that do a lot of M&A that are very dynamic end up finding that NetFlow is a very easy way for them to get on top of the situation with new networks that they're bringing into the fold. So, ultimately, if you have a very complicated environment, which most financial institutions do, this turns out to work better than a lot of the alternative technologies or ways that you can approach this problem. So, with respect to the story in Bloomberg that we started with, what we really want to do there's lots of things we could do with this data, but one of the things we want to be able to do is investigate incidents that happen in our network. So this slide kind of gives you a timeline of an incident investigation. And I use this slide to illustrate a point. So in this case, you've got somebody on your network and they're browsing the web and they visit a malicious website and they download some piece of malware and it ends up getting installed on their machine. And maybe you've got, in this case, you've got like a gateway advanced malware protection system that's investigating content that's being brought down by users. And so it starts its investigation of this download, and maybe 5 minutes later, right, it determines, hey, that was malware that this person just downloaded, so you should do something about that. If you use one of those technologies, you know that they fire retrospectively. The alarm goes off and it tells you that somebody downloaded malware with ED on the end, and now you have to do something about it. So you decide to go pull that system off the network, and in this case, I have the security team getting that system off the network in 7 minutes. Sometimes when I show that slide, people laugh because in their environment, it takes between 24 and 48 hours for their security ops team to be able to get to a computer that was infected and actually disconnect it from the network. That's the practical reality. And so you have to ask yourself, like, what was that computer doing on my network during that 24 to 48 hour period of time? And if you don't have any visibility into east-west lateralization within your environment, you have no idea what that computer was doing. Hopefully, it was just some broadly targeted botnet thing that isn't going to lateralize within your network. But if it was a sophisticated targeted attack, that is exactly what it's going to do. You know, and they don't even, if they can get on an endpoint and then they can lateralize off of it before you're able to disconnect it, they don't even care if your advanced malware protection detected their attack because you know they're in. They've accomplished their goal, and so. And hopefully you won't be any wiser that you were hit with something sophisticated. So that is the issue that a lot of people are facing. And so let me just take you through how that sort of investigation might work using StealthWatch, which is our NetFlow collection product. So let's say the NSA has contacted you and they have said that, you know, here's some IP addresses that are associated with this state-sponsored actor, and we know that someone on your network has communicated with these IPs. So you go to StealthWatch and you input these IP addresses and you do a search to see where those connections were. And so, of course, you know, the NSA is right. It turns out that you have a computer on your network that has communicated with those IPs. So you know that you do have a problem. So the next question is to take a look at the network transactions that host was engaged in around that time. And so here you can see them. There are various web requests that are coming off that host. And it seems that the host may have gotten hit by what we call a drive-by download attack. And the reason that you can tell that it's a drive-by download is because there are you know, a progression of different sites. We go to a site in the United States, and then we go to a site in Romania and another site in Romania. So that's sort of a pattern that's typically associated with drive-by download, where there's a lot of redirection going on, and the browser is quickly moving to different sites. And so, you know, they downloaded some binary, and then we saw this SSH connection come off that machine to a computer on the internet. And more bytes going outbound to the internet on this SSH connection than coming back down from the internet. And so if you think about SSH, when you're logged into a client sends less data than they receive. And so if you look at this pattern of activity here, it appears that the client is the remote site, the destination of the TCP connection, and the server is on your network. And so this is someone who actively has an open shell on your network and is using that shell to do things to your network. So that's not good. So you know, because we have NetFlow, because we can see the activity coming off the switch that this computer is connected to, we can see all of the east-west lateralization from that machine and not just the north-south stuff to the internet. In this case, the machine appears to be scanning our internal network for Windows SMB servers. It hasn't successfully interacted with any, because you can see that there's only one packet being sent in most of these transactions. There's a concern that maybe they're scanning for a vulnerability, or maybe they're looking for file servers that might have sensitive data on them. They're doing something, and you know, we are aware of it, but fortunately they haven't succeeded yet. So another thing we might try to do is go back to that SSH connection that's going to that remote command and control point, because that's a different IP address on the internet that we now know is associated with the attackers. So let's take that IP address and pivot on it and search in StealthWatch to see if we have anyone else in our network that is also communicating with that address. And it turns out that we do. We have 3 other machines, or rather 2 other machines in our network that are communicating with that SSH address. So we've now discovered a few other infections in our environment as a consequence of this investigation. So, you know, this is a quick illustration, but hopefully it shows you that if you're collecting all this network of metadata, it can provide a rich set of information to analyze, to investigate attack activity that's happening in your environment. And so this is what this relates to is what I think is a significant thing that's happening in information security right now, where the incident response process and the role of incident response is really changing. You know, what we used to be hyper-focused on detecting exploit activity and detecting malware, but we know, as I said before, that sophisticated attackers are able to evade those detections. They can get past our IPS. They have malware that your AV isn't going to detect. Often they aren't even operating with malware because they've stolen somebody's credentials and they're logging in over the VPN. And so we really need to look at attacker behavior from a more holistic perspective. And so these guys at Lockheed Martin wrote this paper called The Kill Chain, and it applies this piece of military doctrine about the kill chain to the problem of thinking about computer network security. And the kill chain is the set of stages that you go through. So it's from the Air Force, and it's a concept that relates to the set of stages that you go through when you're going to launch a missile. What are all the ducks that you have to have in a row? You have to target the weapon, you have to know who the target is, you have to confirm that it's targeted properly, you have to get permission from your CO, et cetera, et cetera. So all those things. What is the attacker's kill chain for us when we're defending a computer network? What are the steps that the attacker has to go through in order to successfully achieve their objective? Can we think about each of those steps in isolation? Can we ask, what are the controls that we can put in place that can potentially detect the attacker at each step? And I think the reason this concept is powerful is because it sort of turns the asymmetry of cybersecurity on its head. We used to think about the fact that, you know, running a complicated network, we have to find and block attacks against every potential vulnerability in our entire environment. But the attacker only has to find one vulnerability in order to be successful. You know, this kill chain concept sort of flips that asymmetry on its head. It says the attacker's trying to be covert, and there's a bunch of different stages to their attack, and they have to succeed at accomplishing each one of those stages in order to be successful. And each one of those stages represents an opportunity for us to stop them. So now we have the upper hand. I'm actually giving a talk at Black Hat next week about different ways of using military doctrine to think about cybersecurity problems. This is the quintessential example that has had a lot of influence on people's thinking in the past couple of years, but there's a bunch of other examples we'll be going over in the Black Hat talk. But I think that when you look at this kill chain, what's interesting is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens inside your network after they successfully compromise that endpoint. They're going to pivot around to find data that they're looking for. They're going to pack that data up, and then they're going to move it out for exfiltration. There may be attacks that they launch against other machines inside your network. All of that activity you could potentially detect if you have the right visibility of what's happening in there. So this is why I think you know, we're seeing this change in the nature of incident response. I think it's really a financial change. We're seeing it used to be that organizations in information security, they invested most of their budget on prevention. So auditing for security vulnerabilities, patching vulnerabilities, putting IPS systems in that block attacks that target vulnerabilities, putting in antivirus systems that block known malware, and they spend, you know, a little bit of their budget on monitoring, so they know what's going on, what's being detected, and then they spend, you know, maybe less than 5% of their budget on incident response. And I think that balance is shifting. The preventative stuff is still really important, but you're seeing more being invested in monitoring and more being invested in incident response. And I think the reason is that it goes back to what I've been saying, attackers are able to evade the protective measures that we have in place. But there's a lot of value to being able to investigate the incidents that are occurring because if you can understand what the attackers are doing, you can interfere with them and obstruct what they're doing before they've achieved their goals. And furthermore, the better you understand the incidents that are happening to you, you can take the lessons that you learn and feed them back into protecting your network better in the future. So, you know, I'm starting to see analysts use the term continuous response instead of incident response. It's no longer something that you do, you know, very rarely as a result of a significant incident. It's something that you do all the time. You're constantly hunting within your network to try to find compromises that are occurring and learn everything you can about them in order to defend your enterprise better. I think that's really where information security is going over the next few years. So, you know, as you go through this process of investigating incidents that happen in your network and try to understand them and learning lessons from them. It's really valuable if you share that information with your peers in your industry. And in fact, there's a tremendous amount of threat intelligence sharing happening within the financial services industry. I would argue that the financial services industry probably has the most sophisticated peer threat intelligence sharing that's going on in any market segment, with the possible exception of the federal government. But you guys are pretty competitive. So with respect to StealthWatch, we're a great platform for, as I've illustrated, finding information about threat actors on your network and exporting those things so that you could share them with your peers, such as that SSH IP address that I mentioned before. But in addition, it's a really great platform for taking the threat intelligence that you're getting from your peers and looking for it in your environment, because as I previously mentioned, many of our customers tell us they have better visibility into their networks using StealthWatch than they do with other products in their stack that are supposed to be providing that functionality, because because of the nature of NetFlow's technology, it ends up seeing a more comprehensive picture of what's actually happening on the network. So the screenshot at the top here is a flow table. These are actually Heartbleed attacks. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the reason I put this up here is to circle that little icon there on the right. That's a place where you can export a flow table as a CSV. So anytime you're in the product and you're investigating an incident and you see network transactions associated with an IP address, it's very easy for you to dump those down to a machine-readable file that you can share or parse and reformat. So it's very easy to extract threat intelligence from the product. It's also very easy to utilize threat intelligence within the product. The lower left-hand corner is a custom security event. You can set up security events based on a set of granular parameters about the nature of the traffic you're looking for. It's not just an IP address. It could be, in particular host groups or particular times, and with particular characteristics if you want. We'll alarm if we see anything that looks like that. So it's a very good platform for looking for indicators that you've received. It's also possible to use APIs to do both of these things. So it's possible to have automated processes that take threat intelligence that's being shared with you and load that threat intelligence into the product and alarm if we see interactions with any of those IPs, or conversely, to extract IP information in an automated way from the product so that it can be shared with other organizations. So, threat intelligence is important to the financial services industry. StealthWatch is very important to our financial services customers that engage in threat intelligence sharing. It's a tool that they use very closely with that threat intelligence sharing process. Another cybersecurity threat that's incredibly relevant to the financial services world is insider threat. Given that we're talking about internal network visibility, insider threat is a topic that's fairly relevant, and I could spend a lot of time talking about insider threat. I think that as a profession, information security has learned a lot about how to approach insider threat as a problem over the course of the past couple of years. There's an incredible research effort going on at Carnegie Mellon University at CERT there. Their Insider Threat Center has been studying hundreds of real-world insider threat cases over the years, and they've compiled some very useful, actionable guidance for managing insider threat within a business. And actually, in 2012, they published a book called The CERT Guide to Insider Threats. And if you're an information security professional, I strongly recommend that you have a copy of that book on your bookshelf. I think it's the best account of that subject that I have ever read. One of the key points that they make in that book is that insider threat is not an IT problem. It's really about the relationship that your business has with the employee, and often, these things happen because of a breakdown in that relationship. However, so building a good insider threat program has to do with having a multidisciplinary insider threat management program that involves human resources and legal and management in the process of identifying potential threats to the organization. But once those threats are identified, Obviously people are going to be asking the IT department to be able to go in and investigate and determine, well, hey, this guy left, he was disgruntled, made some threats. We want to know, if he did anything weird, before he left. And often these things happen during the last 30 days of someone's employment, or possibly during the 30 days after they left, which is another interesting discussion. But the bottom line is that internal network visibility is the capability that you want to have in order to be able to investigate that sort of incident. What's powerful about StealthWatch is that you can take identity information and have it automatically stitched into all this net flow we're collecting from the environment. There's two ways to do that. One of them is this thing called the Cisco Identity Services Engine, which is Cisco's 802.1x authentication framework. Often people use it in wireless networks, and it's useful in wireless networks because you don't have a wire in a particular physical location that's connected to a computer. So if you see that computer causing incidents on your network, you need to go get it, and you don't necessarily know where it is. And so being able to quickly see, not only do I see that this computer is engaged in malicious traffic on my network, but I know that it's Bob Smith's Android device. Then I know I can go find Bob and I can go get his Android device, and I can mitigate the incident. It's not just a MAC address coming from somewhere, and that's incredibly time saving. But in fact, a lot of environments are moving toward doing 802.1x authentication, not just for wireless, but everywhere in the environment, so that everyone is authenticated when they access the network, whether it's from a fixed or wireless Ethernet connection. So the consequence of that is that you have a complete accounting of everything that's going on. And if you stitch those identities into your net flow, every single network transaction that's generated by every single endpoint will have an identity associated with it of the person who's responsible for that transaction. In addition, if you're not going to do 802.1x, many people are using like Active Directory or LDAP in order to handle authentication in their environment for their endpoints. We have a solution called the Identity 1000 that will take that data and again stitch it to NetFlow, and it provides a pretty comparable solution for you if that's how your environment is architected. At the end of the day, you have a bunch of identity-based things you could do with the product. The first thing you could do is user reports. So let's see what IP addresses Bob, or in this case Ethel, has had on the network as she moved from her desk to meeting rooms to logging in of the VPN. We can now see every single IP address she had and when she had those IP addresses. And it's a quick search. In addition, we can see all of the network transactions that she engaged in from her endpoint, regardless of where in the building or the campus or from home or wherever she was. If they come to you and they say Ethel quit and she was really pissed and we're worried that she did something to the network, you can very easily look and see what network transactions she was engaged in shortly before she left and make a determination. We've had customers that have been successful with that sort of investigation. So for example, we had a customer who did precisely this. They were looking at an employee who had left. The management was concerned, and they saw that there were a lot of transactions coming off that employee's machine toward this other IP address in their environment, a lot of data being transferred during the last few hours before the person left. And so they went and found that IP address. It turned out it was one of their network printers, and this printer happened to store the last 10 documents that it had printed in memory, and so they were able to extract those documents, and they were all very sensitive, confidential documents that this person was printing off before they left. So they were able to use that as a basis for a further investigation. So that's the kind of thing that you can very easily do. You can also see, and I haven't talked about this yet, what anomalous behavior occurred with the IP addresses that this person had while they had them. And so let me provide you with a little bit of context about that. So one of the things that we do, in addition to just collecting this net flow and storing it, is we do behavioral anomaly detection. What we do is we track the behavior of every host in the network and profile it. We can sort of tell what is typical behavior for that host. And if that host engages in behavior that's way outside of its statistical norms, then we'll alarm on that. And that can be tremendously useful for identifying insider threats, even if you don't have some sort of report from HR. So for example, we have this event called Suspect Data Hoarding. And what Suspect Data Hoarding does is it records how much data each host in the network downloads from other machines on the network every day. And if that host, and it develops a statistical profile for that, where it says that this is how much this host should download from other hosts in the network today. And if that host decides to download way more data from the internal network today than it usually does, then we would fire an alarm. So that could be an example of somebody who's decided to download or scrape a bunch of data from internal data resources today, which they plan to burn to CD and walk out the door with before they quit. This alarm would detect that sort of activity. In addition, frequently when we're talking about sophisticated targeted attackers, we don't, they may be coming in, as I said before, with a legitimate user's credentials. Often when these attacks take place, these guys get inside the network, they target, domain controllers or other sources of identity information. They pull that identity information back, they crack the passwords, and then they log into the VPN, using that person's credentials. And now they're coming into your network, and they're not using malware, they're not using exploits. And so if your security program is all focused on detecting exploit activity, detecting malware, you're not going to see them at all. They look like a legitimate user of your network. But they're doing things that are weird, that are different from what that legitimate user would typically do in your network. And that's where the greatest potential, I think, of anomaly detection lies. It's the fact that although this person is logged into the network like a normal network user, they're behaving in a way that's very different from their normal behavioral profile. And that's how we can identify that perhaps they are compromised. With respect to advanced sophisticated targeted attacks, that capability can be vital. So this Suspect Data Hoarding is just an example. There's all kinds of different behavioral aspects of hosts that we can monitor. We can detect things like reconnaissance, we can detect data exfiltration, we can detect large numbers of sessions, et cetera, things that look like command and control activity. Heartbleed, which I also touched on before, was a bit of a success story for us. When that vulnerability was disclosed in April, the bad guys found out about it at the exact same time that the good guys found out. Everyone found out at the same time that this vulnerability existed and had been there for a while. And so, as a security organization, you learn that news. You come into work that day. You're not expecting that. You find out that happened. You've got to immediately take action to patch machines in your environment. It's going to take you a certain amount of time to patch those machines. And then you're left with this question. Were there any attacks against my environment between the time that this vulnerability was publicly disclosed and when I was able to actually get it patched? Were there any attacks before I got my IPS signatures involved? Because in this case, the IPS signatures from the IPS vendors came out around the same time that everything was publicly disclosed. So, there's a time delay there, and there's a window of opportunity, and there was a tremendous amount of attack activity happening on the internet because this attack was really easy to pull off. And so how do you validate this? Well, it turns out it's really hard for this vulnerability because if you are performing a Heartbleed attack in the right way, it doesn't leave any telltale syslog that you could look for that shows that the server was being attacked in this way. It doesn't. It's pretty stealthy. But we developed this event in our product called Suspect Long Flow, and Suspect Long Flow basically comes from an observation that we have when we look at networks that long interactions between two machines are fairly uncommon, particularly to hosts on the internet. Typically, you're web browsing and you have pretty quick interactions. The last time you spent 4 hours downloading a file was probably 1996, right? So, it's just not the reality anymore. And so typically computers, they communicate fairly quickly and then they disconnect. And so if you have a session that's going on between two computers that goes on for hours and hours and hours, that can be suspicious. Often it's associated with command and control activity, and that's really what Suspect Long Flow is designed to detect. but it happened to work very effectively for Heartbleed, because Heartbleed, with the Heartbleed vulnerability, every time you do the transaction, you get more data out of the memory of the web server. So you're incented to run that transaction over and over and over and over and over and over again for hours and hours so that you get more data out of the server you're attacking. And that causes our suspect bomb flow alarm to fire. In addition, the transactions are all the same size, so you have a very clean client-server byte ratio, and so you can definitely tell that that's what that activity was. You know, we had a number of organizations, some of whom were in the financial services industry, who were successful at investigating their networks using our product to determine whether or not their organizations were targeted with Heartbleed attacks prior to their deployment of patches. And that's a great success story for us, and it goes to show you the way that behavioral anomaly detection can help you identify attack activity that you aren't anticipating. You don't know about the vulnerability yet, but you're just looking for things that are really out of the ordinary, and often that can be sufficient to identify some of this stuff. So that was a great success for us. We were very happy about that. You know, there's lots of things that we can detect with this behavioral anomaly detection. One of the things is just performance issues. A lot of people just use our product to investigate performance of their network. They, you know, you can easily see, you know, who's taking up a lot of bandwidth and what applications are using it for. And so that's a use case that we support. And sometimes the security team will let the network guys in to use the tool in order to be able to investigate network issues. From a security perspective, where we get real concerned about large amounts of traffic coming in is in the context of distributed denial of service attacks. And DDoS attacks are also very relevant to the financial services sector. There have been a large number of activist DDoS activities that have occurred against financial services, particularly in the United States over the past year. In addition to the activist attacks, and the international attacks, we've seen that there was an alarm put out about a year ago, maybe 11 months ago, by the FBI about an attacker that was launching distributed denial of service attacks at financial institutions as a way of distracting their incident response and security team, while simultaneously they launched a more covert attack that was that was designed to steal money. And so, you know, basically it's a diversionary tactic where they distracted the InfoSec team while they went in and got access to some systems where they could engage in financial transactions, and they moved some money around. You know, by the time so what happened is that these incident response organizations would ignore some of these more subtle alarms that were firing because they're fighting this DDoS fire. DDoS attacks have gotten really easy to launch. What's happened out there is, you know, so if you go Google for stressor or booter, you're going to find that there's a bunch of services out there that are offering that if you pay them, they will send a bunch of traffic at the website of your choice. And ostensibly, these services exist so that you can test your website. But the reality is that they don't check to see if the website that you've paid for them to test is one that belongs to you. You know, they compete with each other, and they offer a bunch of different features that evade different kinds of DDoS protection, or that can effectively DDoS different services. They compete on the amount of traffic that they can harness to launch at the victim's site. And it's because of these jokers that we have seen a significant increase in the number of attacks, the bandwidth you know, that people get hit with when they're attacked, the packets per second that we're seeing, because these guys are actually, because of they're competing with each other, they're actually innovating new ways to launch DDoS attacks and increasing the sophistication with which they're launched. So that's very unfortunate. Of course, you know, because we're monitoring net flow, we're a great solution for monitoring what's going on with the network and alarming when you have, because we do this volumetric anomaly detection, we can tell you like how much traffic your network is typically experiencing, and if you're experiencing significant spikes in that traffic, we can alarm on that very easily. So a lot of our customers utilize our product in order to monitor their environment to quickly determine whether a DDoS attack is happening. And that's a key aspect of not having DDoS become a distraction for your security team is making sure that they understand what's happening when it's happening and they're on top of it. So if you have visibility into your environment and you can see that stuff, your SOC team doesn't have to spend a huge amount of time investigating it when it happens. They can see it, they know what's happening, they can take actions to mitigate it, and that allows them to quickly move on to be able to respond to other incidents that are happening in your environment, which are probably also important. So it's really about being able to have a good pace of operations that keeps you from being the victim of one of those distraction-based attacks. I like this map because it shows you us monitoring different layers of the web architecture. You can see on the left, you've got, so often when people launch DDoS attacks, they're using a botnet to do it, and that botnet may infect a different constellation of countries than your website is typically serving. And so what will happen is you'll see, different parts of the world start hitting your website with different amounts of traffic than they typically would. And so that's what that botnet breakdown is all about. It's just sort of seeing where am I getting traffic from. We're monitoring server response times to those different countries, so we know that our server is being responsive. But we're also monitoring traffic between the different layers of our system, between web servers and app servers, between app servers and the database. And we can see not only if that traffic spikes, but also if the traffic usually is there and today it's not happening. And that may tell us that the infrastructure is broken, and that may be the consequence of a deliberate attack. It may be the consequence of a failure. But either way, your SOC needs to know that. They need to react to it. So the ability to have that visibility is very powerful. And of course, that sort of network mapping capability is something you can also apply to your internal network. And it becomes very powerful because people have a lot of difficulty segmenting their internal networks. Their internal networks can be very chaotic. There could be a lot of change happening in there, particularly if you're engaged in a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Sometimes you've got disparate locations, and it's difficult to actually physically get access to the networking equipment. StealthWatch enables you to see everything that's happening in there. And you can begin to organize within the product your hosts into different host groups that reflect their function or location. And then you can begin to construct policies within StealthWatch that monitor the amount of traffic that occurs between these different groups of hosts, and alarms if there's traffic happening where it shouldn't be happening. Even if you don't have a firewall policy or you can't institute one, maybe you've got different computers plugged into the same switch, we can still provide you with an operational alarm if those computers are communicating with each other and they shouldn't be, or they're talking more than they usually would, or they're not talking and they should be talking today. Many people use that as a way of engaging in network segmentation projects. So they start out by organizing their network in StealthWatch and creating some of these policies, and they can see, what kind of real interactions occur in the environment. And based on that, they can start to set some policies. They can monitor whether those policies are effective over time. And then, once they gain confidence using StealthWatch about those policies, they can go make real network configuration changes or make firewall configuration changes in order to make those policies more rigidly enforced. And so it provides you with a way to begin to untangle what is often a very complicated internal network environment for large, complex organizations. So, I've gone through a lot of different topics here, but this was my presentation. I really appreciate your time.